This is Brandon Martinez for nonalignedmedia.com. For many, ISIS is an enigma, but those learned in the dark arts of espionage agencies recognize ISIS for what it really is, a covert mercenary army that doubles as an Orwellian boogeyman, created and fostered from the beginning by Israel, Western powers, and their Gulf state proxies. From its inception, ISIS and its affiliates have served as cannon fodder for the Zionist American Empire's wars in Libya and Syria, a continuation of the post-9/11 Zionist neocon plan to overthrow 7 Middle Eastern and North African countries in 5 years. That militant neocon venture has taken longer than expected, but it is nonetheless moving forward as planned. Let's start from the beginning. The origins of ISIS. We are told by the controlled media that ISIS's meteoric rise to prominence in Iraq and Syria was wholly organic. We are told that the group is self-funded, self-trained, self-armed, and self-sustained with no state backers whatsoever. This is obviously a complete fantasy that falls apart upon the most tepid inspection. The group is allegedly a spin-off of al-Qaeda in Iraq, a militant faction that was supposedly active in Iraq during the formative years of the Iraq War from 2003 to 2007. The origins of this precursor group, however, is just as elusive and murky as ISIS itself. Many analysts contend that al-Qaeda in Iraq, also known as AQI, was largely a propaganda invention of the Pentagon to provide the U.S. with a pretext to continue its murderous occupation of Iraq. Essentially, it was a manufactured boogeyman used by the U.S. to justify U.S. operations and to bolster the Bush administration war myth that al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein were intimately linked. A 2007 New York Times article lent credence to the suggestion that al-Qaeda in Iraq was a fictional, psychological operation. It quotes then U.S. military spokesman Brigadier General Kevin Bergner admitting that the chief of AQI, a man named Abdullah Rashid al-Baghdadi, who's sometimes also called Abu Omar Baghdadi, was a fictional character whose public declarations were voiced by an Iraqi actor. A Los Angeles Times report on the same subject said that, quote, Baghdadi, the supposed leader of an al-Qaeda-affiliated group in Iraq, was declared non-existent by U.S. military officials who said he was a fictional character created to give an Iraqi face to a foreign-run terrorist organization. An Iraqi actor has been used to read statements attributed to Baghdadi, who since October has been identified as the leader of the Islamic State of Iraq group, said U.S. Army Brigadier General Kevin Bergner. This deception was predictably blamed on al-Qaeda itself, but al-Qaeda is and has always been an auxiliary of the CIA since its creation by the agency in 1979 to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. You can be sure that whatever malfeasance is attributed to al-Qaeda, there are American CIA hands behind it. The LA Times article went on to say, quote, the military's claim that the head of AQI is a fictional character comes at a time of heightened pressure on the White House to justify keeping U.S. troops in Iraq. Critics of the Bush administration say the president has been trying to do so by linking bin Laden's al-Qaeda terrorist network to the conflict in Iraq, even though the organization had no substantial presence here until after the U.S.-led invasion of March 2003. The same people that attacked us on September 11th is the crowd that is now bombing people in Iraq, Bush said. End quote. So you can see that the claim of al-Qaeda having a presence in Iraq was a propaganda invention of the U.S. government to justify the war in Iraq and to justify continued U.S. operations in Iraq. So it stands to reason that the group itself, whose leader was an actor, is nothing more than a propaganda tool of the U.S. government to rubber stamp its agenda in the region. There's no reason to believe that al-Qaeda in Iraq actually existed in the form that the mainstream media claimed, but there is plenty of reason to believe that the group was a fictional psychological operation of the U.S. itself. ISIS follows the same historical pattern of intelligence deception. Even the mainstream media has admitted that the group was effectively cultivated in U.S. prison camps in Iraq, particularly Camp Bucca, where dozens of future ISIS kingpins were all incarcerated during the Iraq War and later released just in time for the regime change campaigns in Libya and Syria. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the self-styled caliph and leader of ISIS, was a prominent go-between in Camp Bucca for the U.S. authorities, acting as a liaison between the guards and the prisoners. An interview with a top ISIS commander going by the assumed name Abu Ahmed was published in the Guardian newspaper in December of 2014. In it, Ahmed revealed that Camp Bucca was effectively the birthplace of ISIS, and he made some interesting remarks about al-Baghdadi himself. Ahmed told the Guardian's journalist Martin Chuloff, quote, "We could never have all gotten together like this in Baghdad or anywhere else. It would have been impossibly dangerous. Here, in Camp Bucca, we were not only safe, but we were only a few hundred meters away from the entire leadership of al-Qaeda." Speaking about al-Baghdadi, Ahmed said that the U.S. authorities in the camp saw him as a conciliatory and calming influence in an environment short on certainty and turned to him to help resolve conflicts among the inmates. Ahmed implied that Baghdadi seemed to have a way with his captors. He was very much respected by the U.S. Army, Ahmed said. He goes on, if he wanted to visit people in another camp, he could, but we couldn't. And all the while, a new strategy, which he was leading, was rising under their noses, and that was to build the Islamic State. If there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no Islamic State today. Bucca was a factory. It made us all. It built our ideology. Other mainstream media outlets confirm much of this. A New York Post article said that, quote, according to intelligence experts and Department of Defense records, the vast majority of the leadership of what is today known as ISIS, including its leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, did time at Camp Bucca. Not only did the U.S. feed, clothe, and house these jihadists, it also played a vital, if unwitting, role in facilitating their transformation into the most formidable terrorist force in modern history. By putting the worst of the worst together, the U.S. was essentially hosting a terrorist convention. Early in Bucca's existence, the most extreme inmates were congregated in Compound 6. There were not enough American guards to safely enter the compound, and in any event, the guards didn't speak Arabic, so the detainees were left alone to preach to one another and share deadly vocational advice. Adil Jassim Mohammed, a former detainee, described this to Al Jazeera. Extremists were free to educate the young detainees. I saw them giving courses using classroom boards on how to use explosives, weapons, and how to become suicide bombers. A Washington Post article reiterated much of this information and said that, quote, Camp Bucca now represents an opening chapter in the history of the Islamic State. Many of its leaders, including al-Baghdadi, were incarcerated and probably met there. According to former prison commanders, analysts, and soldiers, Camp Bucca provided a unique setting for both prisoner radicalization and inmate collaboration and was formative in the development of today's most potent jihadist force. With mainstream media, we have to be careful to take it with a grain of salt. Many of these articles, while providing some legitimate information about the origins of ISIS, then pepper it with disinformation and misinformation. A common theme of these articles is that all of this chicanery going on in Camp Bucca with al-Baghdadi and the future leadership of ISIS was unintentional, was unforeseen, that the U.S. authorities had no idea what was going on right under their noses in their own prison, that al-Baghdadi simply tricked them into thinking he was not a danger and manipulated them for his own ends. That claim is simply not believable. When the U.S. government seeks to hide its criminality and the intentionality of its foreign policies, they invoke the incompetence excuse, the "we didn't know, we had no idea what was going on, we're simply incompetent, so don't hold us accountable." It's far more likely that al-Baghdadi and others within these U.S. prison camps were recruited by the Americans to serve as cannon fodder in future conflicts in Syria and Libya, as per the neocon plan of toppling 7 countries in the region. About 100,000 able-bodied men passed through American prisons in Iraq during the war, a huge pool of potential assets in the future of war against Syria and Libya.
The most vicious terrorist leader in recent years, possibly more brutal than bin Laden. Tonight, a former inmate at a U.S.-run prison camp in Iraq says ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man behind scores of ISIS beheadings, was once a trusted inmate by his American captors, allowed to roam freely around the camp.
The Americans seem to see Abu Bakr as somebody who could keep the prison quiet. There are 24 camps within the Sunni side of Camp Bucca. He was allowed open access to all of them.
Guardian reporter Martin Chulov interviewed a senior ISIS commander he calls Abu Ahmed, not his real name. Abu Ahmed says he spent time at Camp Bucca with Baghdadi, starting in 2004. He told Chulov Baghdadi was a fixer at the camp who could settle disputes between competing factions. Quote, he was respected very much by the U.S. Army. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he said, was seen by other detainees as clever, scheming, quote, using a policy of conquer and divide to get what he wanted. A U.S. intelligence official tells us Baghdadi built street cred inside Bucca. Abu Ahmed said Baghdadi and other jihadists at this American prison were not always segregated, essentially allowed to meet freely, to plot, and they had an ingenious way of communicating.
Him and others were able to write their contact details on the white elastic of their boxer shorts, their prison-issued boxer shorts, and that was a way that they networked. And when they got out of prison, they had phone numbers, they had details of fathers, villagers, uncles, whatever.
Abu Ahmed depicted Camp Bucca as the incubator of ISIS, saying it was a management school for ISIS leaders. Quote, if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no Islamic State now.
Most of the senior leadership and probably a good portion of the mid-level management and foot soldiers came from Bucca because, you know, tens of thousands of people were held in Bucca over the years, and so just when they got out, they had little to do, and they had these established networks, and it's clear that they had done their homework in the prison.